Now down to 16 days, 16 days until the general strike against Congress, against partisan politics, against the duopoly, against the status quo. The status quo is not working for tens of millions of Americans, and we can do better. We, the people, have the power to demand that Congress enact our package of legislative solutions. It's crowdsourced legislation, the blueprint for a better America. 200 some pages that will end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. These are all positions that are popular with the American people, and just as importantly, are positions that are supported by the Constitution. To remind us of what our constitutional duties are, I like to start each of these meetings off by reciting the preamble to the Constitution, our mission statement for the United States. You're welcome to join me at home. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. These are the preamble outlines our 5 duties as Americans. And tonight we're going to continue talking about how we can better meet the first one, establish justice. So our legislative package has about 50 different policies that generally break down into those 3 categories of ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, and ending the endless wars. And ending mass incarceration, there is a lot of criminal justice reform policies. There's the police reforms that were included in the George Floyd Justice Act, which we spent 3 days going over, all those sections of the bill. The prison reforms, the Matthew Charles Act that we'll get into starting tomorrow, and the Weldon Angelos Justice Act, dealing with prosecutorial reforms and especially ending the federal war on drugs. Now, for those of you who don't know Weldon Angelos's name, he was a man who was sentenced to 55 years in prison because of mandatory minimum sentences as a result of a confidential informant purchasing half pound of marijuana from him on 2 separate occasions. And so because of that, they bundled together a whole bunch of things, including possession of a firearm, just a whole bunch of stuff. And so the judge had his hands tied. The judge had no discretion to judge the facts of the case, but instead he had to sentence him. He called the judge Paul G. Cassell. He called Weldon's punishment unjust, cruel, and even irrational. And he pointed out that Weldon would have been better off hijacking a plane and raping a child and would have gotten a shorter sentence. But because he had sold marijuana, he had to get a 55-year mandatory minimum sentence. And after asking President Bush to commute his sentence to 18 years or less, eventually his sentence was reduced on appeal. But the idea that someone could get 55 years for a nonviolent offense really just drove home the point that the war on drugs and mandatory minimums have gotten far out of control, that they are not connected to reality anymore. And so the American people recognize this as well. They, in a poll last year, the survey found that 83% of Americans agreed that the war on drugs has failed. So 5 out of 6 Americans say the war on drugs has failed. 2 out of 3, 65%, supported ending the war on drugs. And more than 3 out of 5, 63%, supported reviewing and reducing the sentences of anyone incarcerated as a result of the war on drugs. And so the Blueprint for a Better America, the Weldon Angelos Justice Act, will end the federal war on drugs, and the Matthew Charles Prison Reform Act would offer those incarcerated as a result of drug offenses the opportunity to have their sentences reviewed. So let's just talk a little bit more about this. I mentioned Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, a few times, and just want to reiterate that she concluded, quote, "If we become serious about dismantling the system of mass incarceration, we must end the war on drugs. There is no way around it." And she's absolutely right. There is no way around it if we want to end mass incarceration, and we should want to end mass incarceration. It is a moral stain on our nation that 2 million of our countrymen wake up behind bars every single day. And the federal war on drugs, you know, it has its ending mass incarceration, we say, corresponds to Martin Luther King's triple evil of racism. Ending poverty, his triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, we say, correspond to the blueprint: ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, and ending the endless wars. And yeah, the seeds for the war on drugs were planted back in 1937 as part of the New Deal and the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act. And over time, those seeds grew into the drug war, and it is a poison tree. But its roots are deep in our criminal code. Its branches are interwoven into Supreme Court decisions that deprive us of our fundamental liberties. That, you know, as we've talked about over the last couple of days, the way that Fourth Amendment has been weakened by these Supreme Court decisions, they're a result of the drug war. And the drug war, this tree, this poison tree, it provides so much shade for police corruption. And it's a tree which tens of millions of Americans, disproportionately people of color, have tasted bitter fruit and been left hungry for justice. We can do better. We can end mass incarceration in America. And the place to start is by ending the federal war on drugs. And so the blueprint will do that and give states a choice on how they can opt in to a national framework of taxation and regulation. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start digging into exactly how we do that, starting with section 141 of the Blueprint for a Better America. This subtitle is maybe cited as the Weldon Angelos Justice Act, and then we've got our findings, which I'd like to go ahead and read into the record. The Congress finds the following. In the 50 years since Congress's enactment of the Controlled Substances Act, which authorized and launched the harsh drug war policies sought by the Nixon administration, the United States has adopted increasingly punitive policies towards the possession, use, and distribution of drugs. The United States has built a massive regime to enforce these policies. 2, Congress and state legislatures have adopted increasingly harsh sentencing schemes, such as mandatory minimums, established far-reaching and oppressive civil sanctions and collateral consequences, approved policies weakening the Fourth Amendment for drug searches and seizures, and fostered incentives for aggressive and militarized policing in the alleged pursuit of drugs. 3, every year there are more than 1.4 million arrests in the United States for drug-related offenses, and in over 85% of these arrests, drug possession was the most serious offense. Drug arrests disproportionately impact people of color and more commonly occur in historically over-policed, low-income communities. A criminal record, even for arrests that did not result in a conviction, has a profound impact on individuals, often interrupting employment, housing, family relationships, child custody, and education. 4, a health-based approach to drug use and overdose is more effective, humane, and cost-effective than criminal punishment. Subjecting people to criminal penalties, stigma, and other lasting collateral consequences because they use drugs is expensive, ruins lives, and can make access to treatment and recovery more difficult. 5. Despite high numbers of arrests and incarceration in the United States for drug possession, the number and rate of drug-involved overdose deaths has skyrocketed for over 20 years and continues at epidemic levels. In the first year of the pandemic, 100,000 people died by drug overdose in the United States. 6. Harm reduction services and voluntary on-demand access to evidence-based substance use disorder treatment have proven highly effective in reducing overdose and the spread of communicable diseases like HIV and hepatitis C, preventing drug-related injury and improving health outcomes for people who use drugs. These services should be available on demand for anyone who requests it. 7. Far too many people who desire treatment face challenges that prevent them from accessing the services that they want, including cost barriers, lack of providers, long wait lists. On-demand access to evidence-based treatment saves lives, reduces crime, and saves money. 8. Criminalizing drug use and possession reduces the amount of resources available for harm reduction treatment services and deters people from accessing available services due to fear of arrest. 9. Punitive policies have achieved no reduction in supplies or price, but instead have created unnecessarily risky and harmful conditions for people who use drugs. 10. Punitive policies have led to militarized tactics that thwart the spirit of the Constitution and have led to deaths of innocent civilians. Additionally, the drug war apparatus has cost the federal government hundreds of billions of dollars in direct costs and incarceration costs. 11. While drug legalization cannot fully repair our broken and oppressive criminal justice system or the harms from 50 years of the war on drugs, it will help restore individual liberty, protect against some police abuse, and better assist those in need while reducing spending. 12. In this moment, Congress recognizes that drug prohibition has failed just as alcohol prohibition did, and it is time to move the country in a new direction. It is the sense of Congress that incarcerating or otherwise subjecting an individual to criminal penalties solely for recreational drug use is not justice, which the preamble to the Constitution requires be established by the people of the United States. You know, it's not just, it's a matter of when. Again, 5 out of 6 Americans recognize that the war on drugs has failed. We cannot keep going on this way forever and ever. At some point, things have to change. So the question isn't why, the question is when. And we can do it now. We can generate the political will to force Congress to act by unionizing its voters and demanding an end to the drug war as part of a better social contract. This is common sense, and Congress has failed to act. While they recognize that these things are popular, and President Biden was happy to campaign and say no one should be incarcerated for drug use and promising to decriminalize marijuana, he has done very little to actually make good on those promises. And so once again, we can force his hand and demand Congress put this on his desk before the midterms so that he can have the opportunity to keep his promises and radically rethink the way that the war on drugs works. I think that that concludes section 141 and section 142 is ending the federal drug war. I guess I want to just reiterate at this point that drug use is not harmless, but that drug prohibition is worse for all the reasons that we ticked off in the findings in the previous section. The war on drugs causes immense harm to families, to people, to society, to our economy, and we should expect better. So this subtitle ends the federal drug war by repealing the Controlled Substances Act and it gets the federal government out of the drug prohibition business. And I do mean business. CNBC recently reported that America has spent over $1 trillion fighting the war on drugs over the last 50 years. So when we say end the endless wars as part of the blueprint for a better America, that includes the drug war. And as we'll get to later on, this war that has thousands and thousands of Americans serving in it and hundreds of thousands more as casualties of it, it impacts a lot of our foreign policy. And so we have the opportunity to do better, not just as a country, but to set a better example to other nations around the world, to encourage them to rethink the idea of drug prohibition as an effective harm reduction strategy. All right, so Section 142, ending the federal drug war. In this subtitle, the drug offense means a criminal act associated with the Controlled Substances Act, or an offense that is no longer punishable pursuant to the enactment of or amendments made under the Weldon Angelos Justice Act. So those drug offenses, and this would establish on passage that it is an affirmative defense to any federal drug offense that the intended use was recreational use by a consumer. And so essentially what this would do on passage is create an affirmative defense and essentially decriminalize drugs on the federal level. Now, this doesn't mean that they would be illegal. There's some hoops that we have to jump through before we can get to that, but it would dramatically de-escalate the federal war on drugs by creating this affirmative defense. And so over the next year, we'd be able to wind down the federal war on drugs and give states an opportunity to see what the framework for taxation and regulation looks like that they could opt into, give them the choice to also rethink the war on drugs and adopt real harm reduction policies. All right, so repealing the war on drugs has a number of different components. It is has a lot of roots in our criminal code. And so I'm going to go through real quick and talk about all these different references in the legislation. Number one is repealing. This is the section that Congress says Washington, D.C. is not allowed to set their own policy on marijuana. And they put this section into the budget every year to block DC from exercising local control. And so that section would be repealed. Subparagraph 2, this is the definition of aggravated felony. There's 24 things included in the definition. This just removes the drug trafficking reference. 559B is the repealing this program where the Secretary of Agriculture prevents the growing of marijuana in the national forest system and the criminal penalties associated with that. Subsection paragraph 4 here just strikes the reference to drug trafficking crime. From there, likewise in here we strike the references to Narcotics or Controlled Substances Act from the definition of unlawful activity. Number 6, this is related to drugs coming in on ships. Number 7, this is the Controlled Substances Act. This is, again, was passed more than 50 years ago, and this is where so much of the federal drug war is based. Number 8, these are moved. Subchapters 1 and 2 are mostly covered elsewhere. And these include the congressional findings from 1980. In 1980, the Congress, as they were ramping up the war on drugs, they let's see. Yeah, as Congress was ramping up the war on drugs, the arguments that they made on why it should be escalated included exactly the same ones that are made today, and recognizing the harm caused by drug overdoses and things like that. And all those problems are still with us. So to continue the same policy after 40 additional years of failure, and this is insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. All right, subchapter 9, the Office of National Drug Control Policy would be repealed. Section 10, these are the findings for the for this subchapter. And number 11 is clarifying what the Office of Drug Control Policy, this is what the definition of substance use and misuse is. And so we strike the reference to illegal use and add drugs to the list of other things that are often misused. Number 12 is repealing the Office of National Drug Control Policy. 13 it deals with international narcotics trafficking. 14 is sanctions on opioid traffickers. Number 15, this is relative to withholding highway funds from states, and unless they have a mandatory 6-month suspension of a driver's license for any drug offense. Yeah, this would be repealed as well. Number 16, this is the subchapter in the violent crime control chapter relating to drugs. Number 17, this is the Edward Byrne Memorial Grant Assistance Justice Grant Program, which we've talked about as the way that we have influence over states, encouraging them to adopt these criminal justice reforms. And anyways, and so it amends the list of things that they can do with the grant money. And while they can use it for law enforcement programs, we would exempt those that target drug offenses, and where they're allowed to use it for drug treatment and enforcement programs, we'd strike the and enforcement and allow them to use the grant funds for drug treatment programs. And 18 repeals the chapter on maritime drug law enforcement. All these repeals would be effective on January 1st, 2024 at 12:01 a.m. But as I said, the affirmative defense, this would be effective on passage. So the affirmative defense would essentially decriminalize all of these things. And then on December 1st, 2024 at 12:01 a.m., they would no longer be illegal. They would be wiped from the United States Code. All right, Section 143 deals with retroactivity. To ensure that these repeals are retroactive and that they apply to all cases, Section 143, banking not prohibited. And sorry, let me go ahead and share my screen here again. All right, so yeah, Section 143 is the retroactivity. Section 144 is banking not prohibited. We have a problem right now where marijuana is legal in a number of states, and because the federal government says that it is illegal, when those businesses have to deal with their money, they're sort of cut off from the banking system. There's a lot of there's the risk that if a national bank accepts their money from a drug sale, that they could be penalized, and so many banks just stay away from it. But in any case, they are largely cut off from the banking system, and as a result, often have to use armored cars to move around large amounts of cash, which, as we talked about in one of the earlier sections, has led to situations where the police are pulling over those armored cars and seizing the business money under civil asset forfeiture. And so a whole lot of broken things going on. And this is something that people generally, even Congress, recognizes is a problem. And I believe both the House and Senate have proposed fixes to this to bring marijuana sales into under the umbrella of legal banking activity. And they still can't get it done. Congress is failing to act once again. And so the solution isn't to just hope that Congress will manage to become functional. The solution is to unionize as voters and establish a functional legislative process ourselves by backing up these demands with a block of swing votes. So Section 144 would, on passage, would clarify that these have nothing, that drug-related legitimate businesses would not be raise red flags in the banking regulations, and then go through and update a few references. This long list of things, striking these prohibitions from the Banking Act. So that's what Section 144 does. Okay, Section 145, imposing a sales tax. This is so this would impose a 12% sales tax. I'm going to go jump around just a little bit here. A 12% sales tax on all retail sales equal to 12% of the gross price. And I was at a forum recently where someone was complaining to say that, they're talking, if they were to legalize marijuana on the federal level, that you'd have to pay taxes on it. And if you tried to grow your own, then that would be a crime because you hadn't paid taxes on it. And so this section only puts the tax on retail sales. So if you're doing it, if you are selling your product, the marijuana or other drugs, then that's where the retail sales tax comes in. If you are growing your own, then it's not a commercial activity and there's no money involved, and 12% of zero is zero. Yeah, so that's what that 12% would do. It would impose a new tax that would be collected and go into the Opportunity Trust Fund, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And it'll be used for these three things, the 30, 50, 20 breakdown that we'll get into in just a second here. So a 12% sales tax, again, drug use is not harmless, and it causes many problems in society, but drug prohibition causes many more. So if we're gonna legalize it, or you can tax it and use that tax as a sin tax to pay for some of the harm that is caused by drugs. Which brings us to Section 146, the Drug War Restorative Justice Office. And this would be funded by that 12% tax on recreational sales. And the Drug War Restorative Justice Office would have a number of responsibilities. And so their duties and functions, we'll get into here, include submitting to Congress new legislation that would implement such technical and conforming amendments to further clarify and implement the provisions of this section. So maybe their job as part of the Justice Department to help clean up to propose a way to help clean up any more references, anything else to the related to the drug war in the U.S. Code, and also offer clarifications on exactly how these programs would work. And also to recommend rebalancing these percentages. Okay, remember those percentages that we mentioned a few minutes ago, the 30, 50, 20? This is what they would be used for. The 30% would go to administering services for individuals most adversely impacted by the war on drugs, including job training, reentry services, literacy programs, youth recreation or mentoring programs, and health education programs. So again, these are individuals and communities that have been historically impacted by the war on drugs, and by reinvesting the profits from the legal drug sales into those communities, we can help. This is part of the restorative justice. Number two, 50% will go to administer substance use treatment in a consistently effective manner for any individuals who request such services. So anybody who wants treatment can get substance use treatment. Any individuals who ask for it, these grants would be used to provide it in a consistently effective manner. So there is sometimes fraud when it comes to these big government programs, where people make vague or nebulous commitments about what they'll do with the money. And this would require that these treatments that get the grants that fund the substance use treatment services, that they would have to demonstrate that they were being used in a consistently effective manner. And then number three, the 20% administer legal aid for civil and criminal drug offenses, including expungement of drug convictions. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, a lot of that will be expunged automatically, but to the extent that there still needs to be legal aid, 20% of the money, of the funds, would go to that. Okay, and yeah, initial funding for the Drug War Restorative Justice Office and the Opportunity Trust Fund would be reappropriated from the Office of the Drug Czar. You might remember the current budget for 2023 of $99 million. 1/3 of that went to as startup funds for startup funds for the National Police Misconduct Registry. And then another 33 million goes to start up the Office of Drug War Restorative Justice. Okay, that's what section 146 would do. Moving on, we got 147, which gives them 1 year until October 30th, 2023. For the Department of Treasury, Department of Justice, and the Small Business Administration to issue or amend any rules, operating procedures, or any other legal or policy guidance necessary to carry out implementation of this act. So give them a year to figure out what changes need to be made to wind down the federal war on drugs so that states can set their own policies without interference from the federal government. And then at the same time, in that same 1 year, the Commissioner of Food and Drugs, in consultation with the Drug War Restorative Justice Office, shall issue rules and standards for the quality, purity, and labeling of recreational intoxicating products, which are offered for sale in the United States. Recreational intoxicating products, I'm not sure if I mentioned it specifically, but in the that is the euphemism for sales tax. Sales tax. There we go. Yeah, recreational intoxicating products mean any product or derivative of a substance listed under the Controlled Substances Act prior to the enactment of the Weldon Angelos Justice Act, and excludes any medicine or drug that is a prescribed drug. So in the cases of medical marijuana dispensaries or any other medical prescriptions for drugs that are currently part of the Controlled Substances Act, any medical use would be exempt from that 12% sales tax. All right. Yeah. So within 1 year, set standards for quality, purity, and labeling. Again, we've had over 100,000 drug overdoses in the last year, and so many Americans are dying because they don't know what the quality, the purity of the drugs that they're buying illegally. They don't know what the standards are, and in many cases, trying to buy, it's difficult or impossible to buy testing supplies that people can test their own, or in many cases having the paraphernalia for drug testing or for clean, safer use of drugs can be considered a crime as well. So once again, let's end the federal drug war. Let states set their own policies and give them, and Section 147 will create this framework so that states can opt in to legalizing and selling recreational drugs with a 12% sales tax going back to the federal government, and ensuring that anyone who wants treatment has access to it. All right, brings us to Section 148, expungement. In this section, the term expungement means the removal of the record of an arrest, conviction, or adjudication from each official index or public records. So we will strike previous convictions for drug offenses, and each federal district court will go back within 1 year and review and order the expungement of all previous drug convictions that have taken place since the war on drugs began, May 1st, 1971. To the extent practical, each federal district shall notify each individual that their arrest conviction has been expunged. If at any point afterwards, anyone who is not under a criminal justice sentence, that is an individual who is serving a term of probation, parole, supervised release, imprisonment, official detention, pre-release custody, or work release, would be able to file a motion for expungement after the fact. So to be clear, these expungements would be automatic for anyone who has completed their sentence. The record of their previous conviction would be expunged. If and then anyone who's currently under a criminal justice sentence would be able to file a motion for expungement when that sentence is complete. And the court shall seal all the records related to adjudication of a juvenile delinquency. And the effect of this expungement is that any individual who's had an arrest or conviction or juvenile delinquency adjudication can treat it as if it had never occurred, and shall be immune from any civil or criminal penalties related to perjury, false swearing, or false statements for a failure to disclose such arrest, conviction, or adjudication. So that they would be able to say that they had never been convicted of a drug offense or arrested for one. Now, again, this is a piece of federal legislation, so this applies to the federal war on drugs. And states, obviously, the states do have an awful lot of drug convictions on their states have an awful lot of of drug convictions on the state level. But this would only deal with the federal records, and states would be hopefully would follow the same policy, that as they end the war on drugs, yes, they would follow suit and amend their and expunge those records back on the state level as well. But as a federal level, as a federal legislative package, it does not automatically expunge state convictions. All right, that's 48 expungements. Okay. All right. I don't see any questions in the stream. I'll go and share my screen. All right. Next, we got section 149, the withdrawal from the United Nations Drug War Treaties. Again, the United States is the driver of the international war on drugs. And this has been going on for many, many years. And so we are participants in a number of United Nations treaties. We are signatories to these treaties that expand the federal war on drugs. And so section 149 would opt us out of those treaties. Now, each of them allows for a nation to withdraw, or as they say, denounce these conventions. And so section 149 would require the president no later than the end of this year to give our 1 year notice that January 1st, 2024, we would be withdrawing from these treaties. Now, we've kind of got a problem right now where we're sort of in violation of these treaties because some states have legalized marijuana in violation of these treaties. And there is discussion on the international level of, well, maybe we should amend them and take marijuana out, which would clearly be better than the status quo. However, the best thing to do is to go ahead and just withdraw the United States from these, which will, again, improve our moral standing in the world, and two, will empower and encourage other nations to also re-examine their own drug policies. And the idea that incarceration and criminal prosecution or worse is the way to deal with drug problems. And so that's what section 149 would do. Tomorrow we'll get into the other sections of this, but I just want to say again, drug use is not harmless, but what are the reasons that people use drugs? And there was an experiment done with rats a couple decades ago called the rat park experiment. And they took rats and they put them in this small little cage, and they gave them two containers of water that they could drink out of. One was just plain old regular water, and the other was water laced with cocaine. And so the rats in these little cages pretty quickly got themselves hooked on cocaine, the cocaine laced water. And that was, and that was part one of the experiment. And the next part of the experiment was they took these rats and they released them into a rat park. So think like big size of a parking space area to run around, filled with tunnels and slides and wood chips and other rats to play with, and this huge, play area. as opposed to the tiny little cages that they had been trapped in previously. And once again, they were given their choices of, do you want the regular water or the cocaine laced water? And the rats all quit drinking, quit taking the drugs, and went back to regular water. Once they were able to have a happier life, they were able to connect with other rats and build better relationships, and able to, enjoy themselves. Then drug use was no longer appealing. And so the solution to the war on drugs isn't to incarcerate people, to break up families, and to break up families and make people's lives worse. The solution is to help people have happier, healthier, better lives. And that is what the Blueprint for a Better America does. By establishing basic economic security for people, an economic floor that people can build on with universal basic income, will address a lot of the problems that make drug use seem appealing in the first place. And so as people have happier, healthier, better lives, and the illegal profits from the profit motive from selling drugs illegally goes down, we'll see a shift in America away from, we'll see the numbers of people using and abusing recreational drugs go down. That's how we can really address America's drug problems, is not by trying to crimp the supply, because as we've seen for 50 years, tackling the supply side does not work. Instead, let's go after the demand. Why do people want to use drugs? Let's bring that demand down, bring those reasons down, and again, help people have happier, better, healthier lives. So we can do that. We, the people, can work together to end the federal war on drugs by unionizing as voters. And so if you're ready to end the federal drug war, so that on passage of the blueprint, drugs would be decriminalized essentially on the federal level, that over the next year, anyone with a federal drug conviction would have their record expunged, that the federal government would set up a framework for states to opt into for legalization and regulation, where people who bought recreational drugs would know exactly what it was that they were getting, and thus bring down the tens of thousands, 100,000 drug overdoses that we go through each year. If you want to see a 12% sales tax used to fund treatment services for all who want it, and if you want to see the United States improve its standing in the world by opting out of these UN drug treaties and setting an example for other nations, then join the American Union. Visit our website, anamericanunion.com, become a dues-paying member for $5 a month, and pledge to and join the general strike on October 15th. Where together we will tell Congress enough is enough. We demand change. We demand that Congress put the Blueprint for a Better America on the president's desk within 10 days. And all the members of Congress who do will get the American Union endorsement. And if they refuse to act, all their challengers who have taken up this demand will get the American Union endorsement. Both Republicans and Democrats have been active in this war on drugs for 50 years now. And so it's time for a change. We can do that by moving beyond partisan politics and instead looking at the candidates and separating them into two groups, incumbents and challengers, and pitting them against each other. Who wants a critical block of votes? Who is willing to support the status quo in the last critical weeks before the election, when 83% of Americans agree the war on drugs is a failure? It's easy for politicians to try and be tough on crime, but we can make it easy for them to use common sense and rethink these things by unionizing as voters and linking our demands to that block of votes. So All right. I think that about covers it for this evening. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the rest of the Weldon Angelos Justice Act, some more prosecutorial reforms, and then get into the Matthew Charles Prison Reform Act and look at some second look legislation and sentence reviews for people incarcerated by the war on drugs. So please join us again tomorrow at 7 p.m. And as always, you can learn more on our website, anamericanunion.com. Thanks, and have a good rest of your evening.